Part 1. Ed is back. I know that doesn't mean much at the moment, but it is the reason I have finally decided to tell my story. It will probably take a few posts to get everything out, as I am writing this during my free time at work and at night when my family is asleep. I have never opened up about Ed to anyone, not even my wife. I have had nearly 30 years to think about him and come up with my own reasons to explain my interactions with him, and I will do my best to state what I think versus what I know, though both amount to not much. I will refer to Ed as him, but to be honest, I have no clue what gender it is, or if it even has a gender. I don't care either way. What I do care about is answering the question that has haunted me for almost as long as Ed has. Is Ed real, or am I crazy? My first vivid memory is of Ed. I know I was between 3 and 4, because I was still sleeping on a floor-level bed in the room I shared with my newborn brother, James. My parents had bought a bunk bed for my 5th birthday, and I was sleeping on the top bunk the very same day. We lived in a California trailer park for the first 10 years of my life, and I think the bunk bed was more of a way to use space wisely in our small, shared bedroom. Whatever the reason, I was just excited to be so high off the ground. I was obsessed with astronauts as a child. The 1986 Challenger explosion had happened weeks before I was born, and my father always joked that I was reincarnated from one of those who died in the explosion. And the top bunk gave me a place to live out my fantasies of flying to the moon and palling around with ETs. The first time that Ed visited me, I was woken up by a light, raspy wailing. At first, I thought the sound was coming from James. He'd had trouble breathing when he was born and required monitoring and constant hospital visits for the first 2 years of his life. Strange noises while he slept filled me with concern, activating my brotherly desire to keep him safe. I tried rolling out of bed to check on him, only to find that I couldn't move. Hell, I could barely breathe. When I tried to swallow air, it felt like a fleshy balloon was restricting most of my breathing. It's a strange description, but that's what it felt like. A small balloon covered in some sort of moist skin lodged in the back of my throat, preventing me from breathing or making a sound. Remembering that feeling in my throat still fills me with anxiety. Until that night, I didn't use nightlights because they kept me awake. I wasn't afraid of the dark until Ed came into my life, and for that reason, I didn't see what he looked like that first time because of how dark the room was. But it didn't take me long to realize that the wheezing was not coming from my baby brother. There was movement on the bed near my pillow, and I soon felt his wheezing breath moving my hair. After a bit, he began to run his bony fingers through my hair, pressing firmly on my scalp, wailing in that dry, cracked way that was barely a whisper, but filled me with terror as if it were a roar. All the while, I struggled to breathe, hoping that it was one of our cats, knowing that it couldn't be, because whatever it was didn't have claws. I don't know how long Ed was there stroking my head. It felt like a long time, but everything took forever when I was a kid, and as terror can draw time out even further, it may have only been a matter of minutes. If you're wondering how I knew it wasn't a cat, it's because of the window. The window in our bedroom was kept open most nights to let cool air in and animals out. When Ed was done with me, I heard a thump on the floor behind me and realized I could move again. I sat up with a jolt, my eyes darting to the places in the dark where I heard the patter of movement and his whispering wheezes. I said I didn't see him that first night, which is mostly true. It would be a few more visits before I saw all of him clearly. But I did see his silhouette as he jumped through the window. A large, bulbous head on top of a stocky body far too small to carry the weight of it, the impossibly long fingers of one hand spread out as if they would help him to fly away. In other words, I was right. It definitely was not a cat. I ran to the window panting for breath, since I was finally able to breathe properly, and saw nothing outside but trailers and the bright, distant lamp that lit the gated swimming pool. I stared out that window, hoping for any sign of what had been in my room, for a long time before I gave in and checked on James. After I was sure he was fine, I ran across the room and dove into my bed, positive that if I didn't get under the blankets before the chill up my spine reached my head, that he would come back. I curled up under the blanket as the memory of Ed's silhouette jumping through the window played over and over in my head, my own nightmarish version of sheep jumping over fences, until I had drifted off at last. When I was old enough to learn what sleep paralysis and night terrors were, I tried to entertain the thought that I had experienced those things from a young age and was unable to. He had to be real, because of what I know he did to the toys and the dolls, and what I think he did to the cats and the boys in the salt field. I sometimes tell myself that I don't know why I didn't just tell my mother about that first night, but I do know why. My dad was in the Navy and was on deployments for much of my childhood, so I thought I had to be strong to help take care of her and my brother while he was gone. Admitting fear would have betrayed that strength. I do know that, at least that first time. I wasn't quite sure I believed what happened. The more Ed visited and the worse things became, the more frightened I became of saying anything because I thought my mom would be mad at me for not telling her sooner. I hated disappointing my parents, and there were many times when I hid things or flat out lied in the hopes of preventing my mother's disappointed punishments or my father's explosions of anger. I did ask my mom for a nightlight the next day. I told her it was because I couldn't see very well in the dark, and I was worried I might trip if I needed to check on James. She praised me for being brave and tousled my hair with a smile. As soon as her hand touched my head, memories of Ed running his own fingers through my hair the night before sent chills up my spine. It was weeks before Ed came back, and I had all but forgotten the incident. The first couple of weeks I had closed the window before bed, but my mom put a stop to that one night when the cat clawing at our window woke James up. Our window, unfortunately, was the only one close enough to the ground for the two cats to come safely in and out of the trailer, though the window was still too high for anybody to actually get in the room. At least, that's what my parents told me. There is a reason the cats needed to be able to come and go, and I promise I will explain more once it becomes more relevant to Ed. Back to that bulb-headed monstrosity, Ed. The second time he visited, it wasn't the wheezing that woke me up, but a feeling of tugging on my hair. Again, I was unable to move, and again I struggled to swallow air through the fleshy block that filled my mouth. He wasn't pulling my hair, as I could feel his long, slender fingers on the sides of my head and face. I could just make out the tips of the long, pale digits on his left hand out of my peripheral. I focused on them, wondering how he was pulling my hair without using his hands, until something wet flowed into my left eye, causing them to squeeze shut out of reflex. The liquid continued to flow down my face and near my nose. It smelled like cat food, mixed with the spray my dad used to keep his bike chains from rusting. There was a hint of something putrid, like fresh dung or old roadkill, being covered up by the chemical smell, but I couldn't place it then. I soon realized that the liquid dripping down my face was saliva, and that he wasn't pulling my hair with his hands, but chewing on it with his mouth. I tried to scream then, with every ounce of my being. The groan that came out was barely audible, little more than a gasp, but it was enough for him to release my head and wheeze a hiss at me before I heard the familiar thump and patter move across the floor. My eyes were still squeezed shut, so I didn't see his exit that time. As soon as I could move, I pulled the blanket to my face and began to wipe at my hair and face until the only thing that remained was an uncomfortable feeling of stickiness where the saliva had been. I ran across the room and slammed the windows shut, causing James to wake up wailing and, moments later, my mother to run in, wide-eyed and furious. She turned on the light in the room and shot me a look of tired, frustrated confusion before picking him up and rocking him back and forth until he was asleep again. It didn't take long. She placed him back in his crib and stared at my hair with concern, asking me why it was sticking up in the front all funny. I pointed at her own disheveled hair and let out a weak laugh, telling her I was just like her. She tucked me back in, yawning all the while, and kissed me good night before turning the light off and leaving the room. How she hadn't smelled that vile saliva is beyond me, but it lingered in my nose and kept me awake long enough so that the following day was a blur of grumpy exhaustion and time-outs. Before I put this story on pause until the next update, I need to explain some things about Ed that will become relevant, including the significance of what happened to the toys, the dolls, and the cats. After Ed's first visit, I began sleeping with an Alf doll my parents had bought for me, thinking he would keep Ed away and protect me. I realized how highly inappropriate the show was for such a young kid, but the only thing I cared about at that age was that Alf was from space, and since I wanted to be a spaceman, that made him the coolest. I was so tired the day after the second visit that I didn't notice my Alf doll was no longer next to me on my bed until I couldn't find him the following night. Once I asked my mother to help, she found him within a minute. He was on top of the large dresser where my clothes and encyclopedias were kept. As soon as she spotted him, she scolded me for lying and trying to get attention after a long day of trying her patience by hiding him. It didn't matter that the top of the dresser was too high for me to reach. I had been a brat the entire day, and she was done with my antics. Her anger intensified as she pulled him down and saw what she concluded was the reason for me hiding him in the first place. The head of the Alf doll had been mangled. The cloth that made up the head rested limp and in tatters, looking like some sort of macabre mix of a doll and a banana. One cold black eye stared up at me from the thread it hung by. I never found the other eye. Some of the cotton that puffed out of the neck hole was yellow and matted. She waved it in my face, trying to impart some lesson about respecting the things they bought for me if I ever wanted things again, but I barely heard her. I was too focused on the smell of cat food, bike chain oil, and decay wafting into my nose with each wave of what had once been my favorite toy. Much later, after maybe a year had passed, I was recounting the Alf story to my father when he asked where the doll had gone. He didn't get angry, but did want to know why the doll had been so important to me. I told him it was because I wanted to be a spaceman, and that I wouldn't be able to learn about aliens without Alf, who was what I pictured all aliens to look like. He told me that if I didn't get scared and could keep in mind that they were just stories, he would let me watch a show with him where I would get to see all sorts of different aliens. The first time I saw dramatic reenactments of an alien on Unsolved Mysteries, I screamed, and my dad immediately regretted his decision to let me watch the show, even supervised. I assured them it had just surprised me and, thankfully, he let me keep watching. My parents thought I had reacted out of fear, but that wasn't it. It was because the aliens looked so much like Ed, though they were much taller and skinnier than Ed was, that I was caught by surprise and a scream was what escaped. I was reading at a 5th grade level in kindergarten, and Stephen King by the time I was 9, so I became obsessed with checking out books from the library about aliens, UFOs, Bigfoot, all sorts of unexplained things that Unsolved Mysteries opened up to me, because I thought it would finally explain what the hell Ed was. As it stands now, I don't think that Ed is an alien, though he resembles what most people call greys in some fashion, and though many of the stories I have read speak of paralysis when a being was in the room, it just doesn't feel right. Aliens, in all of the personal accounts I read, my personal favorite being Communion by Whitley Strieber, even when they cause harm, seem to do so for scientific reasons. In that sense, Ed had more in common with Alf than with the Greys, if only because of what started happening to the cats. I can't prove that Ed was the culprit, of course, but I do know what it felt like to have Ed's saliva dripping down my face, and it couldn't have been a coincidence that part of the smell was cat food. Where most aliens were hungry for knowledge, I think Ed was just hungry. I've been calling him Ed throughout this story, but it was only after his 4th visit, when I woke up to find a slew of green army men toys I had placed around my bed frame knocked to the ground with their heads chewed off, that my young mind came up with the name I know him by. Ed. Ed the Head Eater. This is longer than I thought it would be, and I didn't even get into what happened to all of the cats. Charlie the Catman, the boys in the salt field, more things, worse things. I'll write about those in another update. Unfortunately, it's the middle of the afternoon, and I already know I'll be awake all night again. Sleep has become a sorely missed friend the past few nights, and there's a very good reason why I'm getting no sleep. It's the reason I'm finally opening up about Ed the Head Eater, why I, as a writer, am trying to be as thorough with the details as possible. I found that reason on top of my daughter's dresser, a dresser far too high for her to reach the top of, last weekend while helping her clean up her room. That reason was a blanket with a stuffed bear head on it that she's had since she was a baby. That reason was leaking matted, yellow cotton from the rips and tears that covered it. That reason smelled of cat food, bike chain oil, and death.